Hi, I'm Majid Dasugi. I'm chair and dean's professor in the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering. I'm going to be here talking about cost sharing mechanisms for ride sharing. Along presenting with me is one of our doctoral students, Shishin Hu. And I also want to acknowledge our two other co-authors on this project, Professor Nelson Lujan, who's a faculty member at the U.S. Naval Academy, and Phoebe Vianis, who's a professor in the Epstein Department in Industrial Systems Engineering. Actually, this is kind of like one of my favorite talks to give because I kind of like to say a few controversial things along the way in this presentation. I've been working in this domain for about 10, 12 years, basically on, I wouldn't say just ride sharing, but what I call really is under the domain of transportation cost sharing systems. I actually have the belief that in transportation, many of the issues are not capacity issues. In many cases, we have this sufficient capacity. What we don't have is effective usage of it. We don't use what we have existing as capacity efficiently. And that's because there are so many different players. And if you look about transportation, you have so many different players, and each player has their own objective function. So the solution out there is quite different than what you would call a system optimal. If everything was run by one entity and that one entity could optimize, that solution is going to look very, very different than the solution that exists today because everybody's optimizing from their own perspective because of the large number of players. So the thing that really interests me as a researcher is how do you move the behavior of the current system closer to what you would call a system optimal solution. And one way to do that is through incentives and through mechanisms. And this is kind of the idea behind this research.
Majid started without my introduction.
Well, she's shy. Okay. She told me to get going.
So in case you don't all know Professor Dasuki, he is the chair of ISE, Industrial Systems Engineering Department here at USC. He's also a dean's professor. He has been a colleague and has worked with Metrans for many, many years. So he's taught me all about the system optimality. Anything I know about that, he has taught me. He has a very actually long and distinguished publication record. Shi Chung has been working with us on a couple of projects, and I served on her qualifying exam committee, so I can tell you she's done some brilliant work as well. So we are really pleased to have Majid and Shi Chung for our presentation today.
So, I mean, we're all transportation researchers, so I don't have to convince everyone in this virtual seminar the importance of transportation, but just to go over some basic numbers. I mean, from a GDP point of view, transportation is actually not a small player, it's 10%. And the numbers I always love quoting is a study from Texas A&M University. The researchers there, every other year, update their estimates, and the numbers just keep getting bigger and bigger. Basically, the cost of transportation is $160 billion a year, and 7 billion hours in delay time. Just think about those numbers for a second. Even if they're off by 100%, I mean, this is the one that the numbers are so big that even if they're off by 100%, they're still big. So clearly there's opportunities to improve the system that we have out there. So we can't. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of the work we do in terms of really trying to improve congestion. Even a small delta improvement is going to make a big difference from an aggregate point of view. As I started off the talk, is I fundamentally believe we have the capacity in many things. I mean, there's going to be issues that we don't, but I'm sure you're going to be able to come up with an example where the capacity is an issue. But we don't have this. We don't use our existing capacity effectively. And with the wealth of technology and intelligence that we can gather in real time, we should be able to use our existing capacity much more efficiently. GPS systems are very common. Systems are interconnected. We have onboard communication systems. We can use all these techniques or all these technologies to develop algorithms and techniques to improve the efficiency of our transportation system. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on ride sharing, but the kind of the ideas and spirits behind this work really applies to most car sharing transportation systems, which in the world that I live in is a very hot topic. How do we basically use collaboration to reduce our transportation costs? And ride sharing can be viewed as one example. I mean, for us old timers who've been around a while, ride sharing is nothing new. It's just a joint trip between two people. It started, most of us are very familiar with unorganized ride sharing. Families do it every day. Colleagues do it to work. Sometimes you to work for your friends. And in the 70s, hitchhiking was very popular. It was extremely popular. In fact, they had shows called hitchhiking. But I would say, the best example of unorganized ride sharing, which is not done from the traditional, family, colleagues, with really what I would call with strangers, is something called slugging. And what you see on the right is a picture in Washington, D.C. of people lining up just to get in the car with a complete stranger, with an absolute complete stranger to share a trip. And it's a free service. So you ask yourself, there's two places where slugging occurs right now. One is in DC and the other is in Berkeley area. And let me explain why as you can see, it's quite popular. So in Washington, DC, a lot of people live in the suburbs and they work in downtown. And you got the Ring Freeway around there, which is very congested, which is extremely congested. And of course, they have a carpool lane. So people are willing to pick up strangers to be able to qualify the carpool lane. In that case, I don't have the numbers, but I think the carpool lane is like 30–40% takes less time than the regular lane. So it does definitely have an incentive to use a carpool lane in that case. And so people are willing to pick up strangers just to reduce their trip time. The interesting aspect of this is one of the reasons it's successful is that people are more likely to get in the car when there's more than one stranger. So if I'm picking up someone, I want to pick up two strangers as opposed to picking up one stranger. One of these power in numbers, assuming those two strangers are not related, of course. And then in the Berkeley area, what you have is when you cross the Bay Bridge, there's a toll going from Oakland to San Francisco. So people try to avoid that toll by picking up, again, strangers when they cross the trip. The problem with the Bay Area system is that there is no toll going back from San Francisco to Oakland. So in that case, the incentive is not there to pick up somebody on the way home. The reason it works is because in that case, passengers have alternative modes because they can take BART home from San Francisco to Oakland. So it seems to work very effectively. But what I'm here today to talk about is not the unorganized type, but the organized type. And there you got to look at two different players. One is the service operator, which is the person that's driving the car, and the other is the matching agency, the agency that's going to match passengers to drivers. There are two types of matching agencies. One is, I would call, the cost sharing, which is basically one that the company's basically matching not professional drivers, someone who's on their way to their trip to work, wants to pick up an additional passenger, someone that's already going to a destination is picking up another passenger along the way. There, the motivation for the driver is not to maximize their revenue or profit, but to recover some of their costs. The other type, of course, is what and there's companies like Karma, Flink, and other companies out there that do that. In fact, Waze does that indirectly through one of their apps. Then there's other companies, as you know, of Uber, Lyft, and Didi, where the driver is what I would call a professional driver, and their objective to share the trip is not just recover their costs. In fact, their objective is to maximize revenue. So these two types of systems really behave quite differently. So when I started doing ride sharing, the question, of course, is ride sharing has been around a really long time. What really makes you think we're ready for that type of system today? And when I started this, at that time, as I said, 10 years ago, gas prices were close to $4. Maybe people were thinking it was going to get to $5. And I do believe, I'm talking about to transportation people, so you understand the way basically the state funds the maintenance and building of roads, and that's basically through the gas tax. Well, because of more fuel efficient cars, the fund for this is going down, and I believe the state and many transit agencies are looking at ways to increase their revenue to fund just regular maintenance and road network expansion. And one way they could do that, of course, is through hot lanes, basically high occupancy toll roads, and we have one, as you see in the 110. The one on the 110, I believe one way can peak to be as much as $20 a trip, and so high gas pricing. I do see that the future is going to have a lot more hot lanes to fund road maintenance and expansion. I know hot lanes are the motivation for them are to reduce congestion. We could debate that issue whether they do that or not at another time, but they also generate revenue. It's one of the primary benefits. So you have the hot lane expansion, you have increasing gas prices, and then third, parking is heavily subsidized. And you know, at USC, parking is not cheap, but it's still heavily subsidized. If parking is not subsidized, you could once envision a day where commute to work from Orange County to downtown USC could be as much as $25 a day. And then in that case, you start getting to the economic aspect where sharing that cost becomes very important to you as in the individual. So that's why at that time I felt strongly, and I still feel strongly that, and of course the benefits of congestion and all that there is a market for cost sharing, ride sharing systems. So with that said, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the behavior of what I call the revenue maximizing systems, the Ubers, the Lyfts, and the DiDis. I've done some work in this area, and I'd like to share some of that before we get deep into the research about the cost sharing. Again, two types of systems. The ones that where the driver tries to recover their costs, one where the driver is a professional driver and wants to maximize the revenue. Focuses on the former, but let me spend a few minutes talking about the latter. All right, so the revenue maximizing systems are called transportation network companies. In some, they've been called many things. In fact, if you look at the history of these companies, the Ubers and Lyfts, in fact, there will be a business case study on how to start a business and marketing. In some ways, it was probably some of the best marketing. And when these companies came out, Uber, Lyft, they were not called TNCs. They were called ride sharing companies. And that was a very strategic position on their part. Everybody put the Ubers, the Lyfts into what they would call the ride sharing transportation marketplace. And they did that to really implant and convince, I think, cities to let them come in. In many ways, cities were reluctant to authorize the Ubers and the Lyfts in their marketplace because, of course, you had the taxi regulated business that didn't want them to enter the business. So they had to come in and convince the cities to let them in. And one of the ways they made the very strong case that their ride sharing systems and congestion will be reduced. Key thing is they made the case that congestion will be reduced if you allow us to enter your city. And of course, they moved in and they were able to get citizen, I would say, support because of the low costs and everything that when it went to using one of these services. And so they had a very loyal following. And of course, you see some of that today in all the commercials and the proposition that's coming in. But that's beyond the scope of this talk. So they made the case to allow us in because we're ride sharing and we reduce congestion. We now have enough data to really see if that's true. They've been in business long enough now where we can really evaluate, did they reduce congestion? Did their entrance into a city reduce congestion? And there's a very well documented report by a consultant called the Sharlow Report, which came out in 2018. And what they found out is 60% of the users of Ubers and Lyfts and Didis would have used an environmentally friendly system, meaning they would have either used public transit, biked, or walked. So 40% of their customers, in a sense, are stopping to use a personal vehicle, whether it was their own car or a taxi or not. So starting off the bat, you're basically taking 60% of the ridership that would have been using an environment-friendly mode and moving to a car mode. There's a study in the University of Kentucky in 2019 that says that 62% of weekday traffic delays between 2010 and 2016 are due to the Uber and Lyft trips. So beyond the shift of mode of using environmentally friendly to a non-environmentally friendly mode, what about an Uber trip causes congestion to go up? There's also this concept of deadhead miles. Because the driver is a professional driver, he or she has to drive to pick you up. So let's say if I was going to take my own car on this trip, let's say my trip length is X. So I'm going from A to B and it's X miles, or it takes X time, whatever units you want to use. If you're going to take Uber, the Uber driver has to, let's say they're at C, they have to go from C to A. That distance is Y. So the total trip of that is Y plus X. The Y portion in the lexicon is called the deadhead miles. And of course, as there's more and more users, Y gets smaller and smaller. But as you can see, in San Francisco, 20% of the trips included deadhead miles. In New York City, it was 50% included deadhead miles. And in fact, it's more than just that you have more and more users, you can reduce deadhead miles. It's that the drivers themselves are independent. They strategically drive to locations that may not minimize their Ys, but they drive to locations to maximize their revenue. So they may be driving after drop off a passenger to a pickup, which is going to maximize their revenue, as opposed to one that minimizes their deadhead miles. Because of that, Shawla concludes that 5.7 billion vehicle miles have been added annually due to the TNCs. I will say that this research neglects one important aspect about the benefits of Uber and Ryder, and that is there's less time searching for parking. And there's been studies, and there's a famous professor at UCLA who focuses on parking and the impact of parking. There's a study out there that said 24% of the trip travel time is looking for parking. Seems kind of high to me. I don't think it's true for commuting traffic, for commuting trips, because if I'm going from A to B, from home to work, I typically know where I'm going to park. Like if you're going to use the example of UCLA or USC, when I drive at USC, I know where I'm going to park. I'm not going to really have maybe from a faculty's perspective, I'm really not going to have a hard time finding a parking. So those are some background behind that. So along with Professor Pang and Professor Ban, we've developed a model to predict an increase of vehicle miles with people adopting the Ubers and the Lyfts and the Didis of the world. So if you look at this plot, the x-axis says the percentage of the travelers who take an Uber or Lyft, going from 0 to 100%. On the y-axis is the percentage increase in VMT over everybody driving solo. And we do this plot for different, let's say, OD demand patterns. And we look at a symmetry of 0 means it's a totally asymmetrical case, meaning all the origins are one end of the trip and all the destination are the other end of the city. So basically you have to go back and forth to go pick up another customer. And in that case, that's going to be the blue line on top. And as you can see, as you adopt more, it's going to be a linear increase in VMT because you just have to go way back again, go pick up another passenger. There's no basically, the dead miles in that case are very large. The other case is when you have a perfectly symmetrical system, whereas if you drop off someone, there's going to be another pickup right there. So you're going to have very little development model. And that's the line near the bottom where you basically have no extra miles due to the Ubers or the Lyft. But most cities are in between in terms of their spatial demand patterns. And so what you see is as you adopt more of the Ubers and Lyft, you're going to have an increase in the trip miles as you go along. So what are some of the challenges and research questions when you talk about ride sharing? There's a lot of public policy. And remember, I'm an engineer, so I'm going to look at it from an engineering perspective. And so some of these things that you see, you're saying, oh, there's all these other topics that he's not covering. It's because I'm coming from an engineering perspective. I'd probably argue also from an engineering perspective, I'm missing many of the topics. But one of them, of course, is if you're trying to do matching, it's a large matching problem. Riders have many different preferences in terms of the type of vehicle, the cost they're willing to incur, the travel time, the flexibility, how much flexibility in the route, whether I have preferences for the gender that I'm willing to share the trip with. The good news is we have software assistants that can do this. These are large-scale optimization problems that can balance different optimization criteria. They can determine multiple riders for a particular trip. They can also incorporate transfer points if that's needed. And they can determine the best possible routes. So I think we stand a good chance of trying to solve these problems. Another research challenging problem is, of course, the trust and reputation business. Trust and reputation is actually one of the most advanced topics because I think as a society, we have become pretty familiar on how to use and evaluate systems online. You know, we do this with Yelp, we do this in almost all the travel advisory, TripAdvisor, or you have some kind of feedback comment systems. We have payment mechanisms that are pretty secure through online research. So this is probably one of the most advanced, and really we've almost solved this problem in terms of how you do trust and reputation system. I will only add, there have been some studies for the TNCs. Their reviews tend to be actually inflated compared to other systems. If you look at Yelp reviews versus Uber reviews of drivers, the Uber reviews tend to be a little bit inflated. And I wish, you know, we could do this live and we could have an engaged discussion on why we think that's true. But when you have a virtual kind of presentation, you're kind of limited in kind of the engagement you can have and participation. But if we have time at the end of the question and answer period, we can talk a little bit why this might be the case for these type of systems as opposed to, let's say, restaurants or other types of rating systems. Why rating systems for the Ubers and the Lyft of the world would have a higher rating system. Okay, next, please. Okay, so I want to get now to the heart of this talk. And what I want to talk about, I think that I'm missing a couple of slides. Can you go previous? So there are three other talks. One is the mechanism design, which is really how do we share the cost, which is really the heart of the talk. There are two other aspects that you want to consider when you talk about ride sharing. One is routing. Routing for ride sharing, if anybody's familiar with vehicle routing, is quite different than almost any type of routing. Most routing systems basically follow one general rule, and that is each additional demand, the cost function will strictly increase. In ride sharing, that may not be true, because if I get one additional demand, I may not be able to qualify for a HOV lane or a toll waiver, which means that the cost function may actually go down. So in ride sharing, routing doesn't follow the traditional cost structure, meaning that each additional demand, the cost function is going to strictly care. So we've developed models to take into consideration, not the focus of this talk. And then we also have some equilibrium models, which predicts how many people are going to adopt ride sharing if our incentive policy is this. Given this incentive policy, how many people are going to adopt it? Very similar to the model I showed for the TNC, we have the same type of models for ride sharing. So now we're into this environment. Now we want to figure out a mechanism which is going to determine how people are going to share the cost of the trip. And so what do we want out of this mechanism? We want to develop a mechanism which is fair, no subsidies. Basically, the users of the system pay for it. We want to make sure that when a passenger commits to it, they have no incentive to drop out after accepting the fare quote. And the last one's very important. We want to develop an incentive where people submit their requests as early as possible. Because in routing and in most optimization model, the earlier you have the information, the better you can optimize your solution. And that's one of the things that we're going to consider very, very much in the system that we're proposing. And we want to, of course, give the fare instantaneously, meaning as soon as someone makes a request, we quote them a price immediately. Now that price may go down as more requests come in and you match more people to the car, but we're at least given an upper bound on the fare quote. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do this through an example. And this example is going to be done for a shuttle service because it's easiest to illustrate the examples if you assume a shuttle service. And then when I'm done with this example, I'm going to pass it on to Sushin, who's going to then show how this example can be modified to include ride sharing. So ride sharing is different than a shuttle service because in ride sharing, you have a driver who has their own origin and destination. Whereas in a shuttle service, you basically have a professional shuttle, which is picking up people to drop them off. And the question is, how do you split the cost of the shuttle service? This is the example I'm going to give. The added dimension when you have ride sharing is now you have a driver who also has their origin and destination, and they want to share their trip with these existing passengers. So let's assume we have a shuttle at the star point in this slide, and they want to go to. So you have three passengers. Passenger one happens to be also at the start point and wants to go to the far right, and their trip time, let's say, is 2. Then you have passenger 2, who also starts at the star, but they want to go all the way to the other end of the trip. And then you have passenger 3, who starts at the far right and wants to go to the far left, and they have a total cost of 4, or let's say 4 miles, or whatever unit you want to use. Let's say they call in the order of 1. First passenger calls up, second passenger calls, and then passenger 3 calls. And remember, we want to give them a quote the minute they call, okay? So the first passenger calls, the total cost, let's assume the cost per mile is 10. And so let's say it was 2 miles. So the total cost when passenger 1 calls is 20. Since before the trip, the cost was 0, the marginal cost would go to 20. And then the question is, what should we charge this passenger? We'll get to that later. But let's say passenger 2 calls. Still, the service is to go from the star to the far right point, and then come back, pick up passenger 2, and take him back to the far end point. That's a total trip of 6. 6 times 10 is a total cost of 60. But the marginal cost went up to 4. Now, passenger 3 calls. The optimal tour still is pick up passenger 1, drop him off, pick up passenger 3, head back the other direction, pick up passenger 2 at that point, and head back to the final destination. The total cost remains 60, but adding passenger 2 or 3 to trip, you see, added no increase in cost. And so their marginal cost is 0. So based on that information, how would you charge the trip to each individual passenger? So there are different ways of doing it. Let's say our service charges everybody a fixed fare, and let's say the fixed fare is 10. So each person would be charged 10 units under the first fixed fare policy. Incremental, let's say, is saying we'll charge everybody the marginal cost of that they incur. So the first passenger would be incur a cost of 20, second 40, and the last would pay nothing. The third one says that we'll charge them in proportion of the distance they need. So in that case, the total cost is 60. The first passenger is a quarter of the trip. Second one is a quarter, and the third one would be a half of the trip. So you charge them in proportion. So let's talk about if you're going to say which one's the best. We have to have a criteria to choose the best. Okay, so these are 3 different proposed approaches, but we have to, if we want to pick the best one, we have to have a criteria. So what I'm going to show you now is some properties we want our cost sharing mechanism to hold, and we'll see which ones these hold. So the first criteria is that we want online fairness. And what is online fairness? It basically says if I use more of the service, I should pay for more of it. So if I use more, I should pay more. But basically online fairness. Immediate response says when I'm giving your initial quote, that's an upper bound. That is, and even if passengers get added to the trip, my cost can only go down, but they cannot increase. Budget balance says it's no subsidies and it pays for itself. The trip will pay for itself. Individual rationality means people behave rational, meaning that if I give you a quote that's below your willingness to pay, that you'll accept it. And if I give you a quote that's above your willingness to pay, you'll reject it. And then the ex post incentive compatibility means that everybody basically gives the information to you truthfully. There's no incentive for them to lie. If they lied and tried to game it, they'll be worse off. And so all these are very important properties to hold if you want to have an effective cost mechanism sharing system for this system. Next slide, please. So if you look at the fixed fare procedure, you don't know who's going to be, and you don't know what the customer demand is. So it's very difficult to come up with a fixed fare policy, which is going to be budget balance. You may be lucky and get a budget balance policy, but it's not going to be guaranteed to have. Let's just do the incremental one. The incremental one is not going to have online fairness because, as you can see, passenger 3 takes the most. They consume the most demand, and yet they're paying the 0. So obviously it's not fair. The proportional looks pretty good on paper, but it fails to satisfy the immediate response property. Because I don't really know that 15, 15, 30, I don't know to quote the first person 15 when they make the initial call, because I don't know who else is coming. I don't know who else is going to be calling. So it fails the immediate response property. So what we have developed is something called POX. Next slide, please. So what POX does is it basically is a mixture of both, I would say, incremental and proportional. It forms passengers in correlations, and passengers in the same correlation share the costs proportionally. Passengers between correlations share the costs marginally. And I typically would have time to go through and illustrate the POX mechanism on this example. But just keep that in mind, that it basically is a mixture between proportional and incremental. And because of that mixture of the two, we can basically come up with a mechanism that satisfies all 5 properties. And I think we finished at 1, so I don't want to take all the time. So I'm going to pass this on to Shishin, and she'll describe how we can alter this mechanism for the ride sharing example. Shishin?
So right now, I'll pick up from now on. So previously the POX mechanism was originally designed for the shuttle service. As described by Dr. Dasuki before, the shuttle service is not exactly the same as the ride sharing context that we are interested in, because like in the ride sharing case, like everybody has its own origin and destinations. Like as well as the drivers. So therefore there exists a problem is like previously for the shuttle service, you just share all the total costs among the passengers. But right now, because the driver has its own direct cost, like if he's picking up no passengers, he has his own direct cost, we call it F here. And how do we share that? So basically what we did is we came up first with this framework. We call it the ride sharing mechanism framework, and I'll refer to as RSMF for the next slides. So what we basically do here, is that we break the total cost, as you can see here, break the total cost into the driver's direct cost F, as well as the total detour cost. And the total detour cost we define here as like the total operation cost minus the driver's direct cost F. And then what we do is we share them individually. And under this framework, it is designed that you can basically use any sub mechanism for each component of this total cost. And then like it should have certain like properties under like certain constraints that we put on it. And for now, what we did was like, even though we can use any sub mechanisms, as you can see here, we use the POCs for now to share the cost of the total detour. So keep in mind like the properties of the POCs, and it will apply to that part of the shared cost. And what we did is we also proposed like 3 different mechanisms in sharing the cost of F, such that it has some like really good desirable properties we described before, and also some new properties that we identify here. As you can see is first is the reduced burden for the first passenger property. What this really means is that we want the initial, like in the initial quote for the first passenger, its shared cost of the driver's direct cost should not be equal to F. It should be strictly less than F, such that it won't impose too much of burden to the first passenger, and then it might be just back off and there will be no ride sharing operation to start. And the second property that we identified, which is desirable, is that we want to have the fairness in sharing the driver's cost property. Meaning, like no matter how meaning like the final shared cost of passengers in sharing the cost of F, it should be proportional to their demand, which is like intuitively fair. And like what we designed is we designed this framework to constrain the sub mechanisms that we choose for sharing the cost of F to satisfy the new properties. And next, I'll introduce them like the 3 mechanisms in detail. The first one is called the driver out of collision mechanism. So basically, the idea for this is pretty simple: is that we want all the passengers share the direct cost of F proportionally, and also while we are forming all of them into one single collision, the driver is out of that collision. So in what we have here is that like the advantage of this mechanism is we have all the 5 original desirable properties satisfied, and we also satisfies the fairness in sharing driver's cost property, but we fail to reduce the burden of the first passenger. And actually, through our research, we find out that like these 2 new identified properties, they contradict with each other under certain circumstances. And this is shown in our paper, like it is like under proposition 2. And the next one is called the driver in collision. So it is pretty intuitive because like remember, as like in the driver out of collision, we have the disadvantage here that it fails to reduce the burden of the first passenger. Therefore, we generally want to see how about let's include the driver in the collision to share the direct cost and what will things be like. So everything else is the same, but right now the driver is in the collision, and what we find out is that, okay, it satisfied all the 7 properties that we wanted. However, the driver's cost is not fully recovered, and this is also pretty clear because, as you can see, even though like no matter how many passengers it take along his or her way to their own destination, it won't fully recover it because they are always in the collision in sharing it. So aside from these two sub mechanisms, we have a third one, which is a little bit different from the previous 2. We call it the passengers predicting method. So what we do with this is basically, remember before, like one issue of this ride sharing scenario is that we want to provide the initial code like immediately when they request service. However, we don't know how many other passengers are going to be on board, like when the first passenger or the second passenger like requests. Therefore, we generally want to predict how many passengers would there be, and then we devise something based off that. And what we have here is that we first predict the total number of passengers by adapting a robust optimization method. And then we calculate their share of the share of the driver's cost F, as shown in the equation here. And basically is like the passenger's own demand divided by the total demand of the estimated passengers. And what we find out, the pros and cons for this mechanism is that it satisfies 6 out of the 7 like desirable properties that we wanted. However, the budget balance property is lost because you are estimating the number of passengers, and it might be accurate, like it might be 100% accurate, it might be not. And what we also find out here is that you can increase the prediction accuracy, and then you can mitigate the budget balance error. And after we said all those after we propose all those like different sub mechanisms under that framework, and which is like a really basic scenario, and then we extend it to the scenario where we want to include time constraints, because like in real life, people have their preferences of how many time they want to spend in sharing a ride. And also we impose this here because the drivers are not professional drivers. They also have their like maximum time they can spend to operate this ride sharing operations. So what we have here is that every one of them in the system have a limit of how much time they want to spend in the vehicle. And what we use is an inconvenience cost function to measure the delays past their time window. So for example, on the figure on the left here, it shows like it can be an inconvenience cost against an in-vehicle time for a passenger or a driver. And what this says here is that, let's say for this particular passenger, like its direct trip time between like his or her own destination is like 4 minutes. That's the quickest time. And ever after that, he or she is having some like time value functions. And what we have here is like a linear time value functions, meaning like the inconvenience cost generated for him whenever he spent like 1 or more minute on the in the vehicle, it's going to be linear. And as you can see here, like his or her maximum like tolerance of in-vehicle time would be 7 minutes. So like basically the setting for this this scenario is like every passengers will have a inconvenience cost function like this. They might be the same or they might be different, but like right now we like constrain it to be linear. And then the question comes is like, when we have this inconvenience cost, how do we share it? How do we share the total cost? And what we have here is we want to continue to work under the RSMF framework, which is the ride sharing mechanism framework. Remember previously it is like additive components. So what we have here is we add another component called the discount component to this mechanism framework, and we want to see how are we going to proceed sharing the cost like based by adding this extra component. And the reason that we add this component is really because, as you could see before, we have the inconvenience cost. Therefore, we do want to provide discount to them to incentivize everybody participating in the operation. And so right now, the next step is how do we decide the discount amount? So what we have here is we devised the 2 different methods. The first one is called the basic discount method, and the second one is called the inconvenience cost-based discount method. And I'll talk about them one by one. The basic discount method, what this generally means is that the new passenger will be responsible for all inconvenience costs he or she generated for the previous passengers. And the pros and cons of this method really is, as listed here in the slide, is that it satisfies like 5 out of 7 the properties that we have, with like the online fairness property lost and the ex post incentive compatibility property lost. And another advantage for this method is that like the passengers are not responsible for the inconvenience costs that are not caused by themselves. So like what this really means is whenever like a new passenger comes in, and then the system calculates, okay, by adding this passenger to the route, how many increase in vehicle time for other passengers are there, and then calculate the inconvenience cost of all of them and put all that responsible, and the new passenger should be responsible for all those inconvenience costs. So on the contrary, we have another method here, the inconvenience cost-based discount method. And this is a similar way to the POX in how you share the discount among all the passengers. Basically, the passengers form coalitions to share the total inconvenience cost in a manner that is similar to what we have in the POX. And the result here is that we have only the online fairness property lost with all the 6 other properties that we want satisfied. However, in this method, the passengers with high tolerance for time, they may not get any discounts while being responsible for part of the total inconvenience cost, and that is somewhat sounds unfair. And also with this method, it requires more memory and timing simulation compared to the basic discount method. So with all those mechanisms and discount methods in mind, we now get to the experiment section to test the performance of different mechanisms. The first part of the experiment is we first want to test the 3 proposed sub-mechanisms without the discount first. And that is the driver out of collision, the driver in collision, and the passenger's prediction method. And the settings here is really on a small data set. We are using randomly generated data set on a 40 by 40 grid, and we assume the cost per mile is $1. And in each replication, there is only 1 vehicle and 4 passengers. And we are using a cluster spatial pattern where the clusters are generated within a 10 by 10 grid. And the results are averaged over 100 replications. And the reason we chose the cluster spatial pattern here really is, remember the ride sharing context that we study is the driver has its own origin and destination schedule, and usually this kind of ride sharing exists on a commuting trip. Therefore, the working areas and the residential areas are somehow clusters. So that's why we are choosing this spatial pattern. So here are the results of comparing those 3 sub-mechanisms in sharing the driver's direct cost F. And what we find out here is that these 3 columns of data supports our theoretical analysis. Because if you take a look at the first column, which is the performance results of the driver out of collision mechanism, it indeed recovers all of the driver's cost, satisfying the better balance. And on the contrary, it does have the highest highest average passenger cost because the driver is kept out of the collision in sharing the driver's direct cost F. Therefore, the passengers are gonna have a bit more to share. And then if you take a look at the second column, which is the driver in collision column, it does produce the lowest average passenger cost compared to the other mechanisms. And also, as you could see here, is it does not recover all of the driver's cost. It only recovers 80% of it, and it will provide some reduction in the burden for the first passenger, as we could see here is almost 40%. And also, if you take a look at the last column, which is the results for the passenger's prediction mechanism, it kind of balanced between those 2. It does not have it has the second lowest average passenger cost, and it provides the most reduction in the burden for the first passenger, and also it can have nearly 100% of the driver's cost recovered, and also the budget balance error is only 2.2% in our test cases. Therefore, in this simple small data set case, as a result, we want to choose the passenger's prediction mechanism for sharing the F for the further experiments in testing the discount method. So with that kept in mind, we now want to test the discount scenario. However, the previous small data said it will have low probability in passengers having inconvenience cost. Therefore, intuitively, we want to go with large data set. that has like thousands, hundreds of like passenger requests and drivers. However, in that case, the problem becomes too large to solve optimally. Therefore, we want to use the heuristic method for quick solution with good quality. Because remember, this is an online ride-sharing system, and we want to calculate the route as quick as possible. And when you use heuristics, the ex-post incentive compatibility is lost. The reason why it is lost is explained in the paper, and we also test the effect of it in the paper as well, because we don't have a lot of time here to explain them in detail. So I'll go ahead with like our experimental design for the discount case. So first, I want to introduce our data set here. This data set is, as you can see here, all the red dots are road sensor data by LA Metro, and it is archived by researchers here at USC, and especially Professor Giuliano was like one of them. And this is like the road sensor data is like placed within the LA County region, and it includes 33 sensors on 7 different freeways. And out of this sensor data, we generated an origin and destination probability matrix. And out of this OD probability matrix, we randomly generate the actual ODs in our simulation. So here are the general settings. What we assume is we first assume an average vehicle speed of 36 miles per hour. And we also assume each passenger has different linear function value of the in-vehicle time. And what we said, the maximum in-vehicle time is like 1.5 or 2 times their direct travel time. We are controlling, we are changing this parameter to see like how the performances are going to change. And also we want to change the parameter, which is the willingness to pay level. We change it from 1.5 to 2 to 3 times of the passenger's direct cost. And notice here, the passenger direct cost is not too like confused with the direct cost of taking a taxi. It means like a direct cost, like the lowest direct cost of getting from your origin to the destination. And we also like want to test like in this system, there is 1,000 passenger requests, and we want to see like the different number of drivers, how will different number of drivers will impact the performance results. And again, all the results are averaged over 100 replications. And a summarize of these settings are shown in the table here. So together, we have 5 different scenarios, with the first one set to be the base scenario. So here is the results for like all the scenarios. Well, let's first take a look at table 4, which is like the results for the base scenario. So in this scenario, what we can see here is that out of the 2 different discount methods, they all indeed provide like certain incentive for the passengers, because as you could see here, the shared cost the shared cost per passenger is going up compared to the scenario where there is no discount. And this really is because all the discount, all the inconvenience cost generated within the system, the passengers are dealing with them. There is no extra money you put in there. There's no money you gain from it. And as a result, like the shared cost per driver goes down compared to the no discount method. And another interesting thing we can see here is that the basic discount can serve more requests compared to the ICBD discount method, which is the inconvenience cost-based discount method. And however, it has like more no passenger vehicles in the system. So what this suggests really is that it is like really condensing the assignment of passengers to drivers compared to the ICBD method, while the ICBD method really is trying to distribute the passengers onto different vehicles. And And like we have here in table 5, which is like the performance results for scenario 2. So let's go back to see scenario 2. What is different? The difference is that we increase the time limit. So all the previous patterns, like the difference between the discount methods, then the no discount case, are going to be the same in the scenario. The extra insight comes in what will increase in the time limit will bring us. So what we have here is that the total operation cost went up. And this makes sense because like when you are willing to like have more time, spend more time in the vehicle, and the driver is willing to spend more time in the operation, you are picking up more passengers. And as a result, more number of passengers are served. And as you can see, it's like roughly like 15% of increase in the percentage of requests served. And also there are less like no passenger vehicles. And as a result, what you can see here is that the shared cost per driver compared to the scenario 1 further goes down. And this makes sense. This is consistent with like more passengers served because each driver is picking up more passengers along the way. And next, what we have here is that the performance measures for scenario 3. Again, let's go back. So what is the difference between scenario 1 and scenario 3? What we have here is everything else is the same except for the number of drivers went up. So again, the pattern between different methods are the same as the base scenario. Well, what will the increase in number of drivers bring to us? Again, this brings us like there will be like more passengers served, of course. And as you could see here in the as you could see here in the results, it also increased roughly like 15% for them. And however, because you are having more vehicles than the base case, and what you can see here, there is like more no passenger vehicles there because they are starting off at a different number. And an interesting here we see is that the increase of percentage of number of requests served for the ICBD method is pretty high compared to scenario 2, because remember here you only have 86%, and right here you now have around 90%, which is like around the same as the other discount method and the scenarios. And this really is because what we described before, the ICBD is trying to distribute trying to generate a more distributed matching system, and therefore when you have more like more drivers there, and it will like equally spread all the like extra all the unserved like passenger requests onto the drivers, and it will increase like the number of requests served like more. And also what we have here, all the others are pretty much similar. Yes, the shared cost per driver are gonna be higher than the base case, and the shared cost per passenger are gonna be higher than the base case. And the total operation cost per vehicle, as we could see here, is not as high as that in scenario 2 because we are having more vehicles here. So next step is we want to test the sensitivity analysis on willingness to pay level. So if we change the willingness to pay level of each passenger, what will it impact on the performance measures, mainly the shared cost per passenger, the shared cost, the driver's share cost, and also what we have here is the percentage of requests served and also the number of no passenger vehicles in the system. So let's first take a look at these two figures. As you can see here, as we increase the willingness to pay level, like both discount method will show an increase in the share cost per passenger. And this is pretty intuitive because as you are willing to pay more, you are kind of spending more. And on the right, what we have here is because people are willing to pay more, and therefore there are higher chances that like the drivers getting more passengers along the way. Therefore, the driver's costs are gonna like go down for both discount method. An interesting thing here to point out is that, again, the ICBD method, the driver's for the driver's cost, as you increase the willingness to pay level, it benefits a lot from the increase of willingness to pay level. And this really is, again, because of the distributed like pattern of this method that generates to the system. And next, what we have here is the percentage of requests served. And as you could see here, when you increase the willingness to pay level, the number of requests served is increasing as well for both discount method. And again, the ICBD method benefits most out of it because of the distributed pattern. And also, as we can see on the right figure, the result for the number of no passenger vehicles is that it experiences like a reduction in the number of no passenger vehicles as you increase the willingness to pay level. Because when people are willing to pay more, there are a higher chance it gets matched to like a driver that it previously with low willingness to pay level won't be accepting that quote. And when now you have like more tolerance in the amount of money you pay, you are more likely to get assigned and participate in the system, and there will be less no passenger vehicles. And this is actually consistent with the figure on the left, which is like the increase in percentage of requests served. So to conclude, what we have done like in our project really is we first developed the mechanism framework. And the framework, remember, it is putting additive like components together and then use sub-mechanism in each component. So it is pretty modular and flexible, and it can cater to different requirements. And out of the framework, we propose 3 different mechanisms in detail. And what we find is that the passenger's predictive mechanism balances the driver's cost with the passenger's cost. And after that, we extended to the scenario where there is like time constraints, and we developed the 2 discount method. And what we have here, the insights are the basic discount method outperforms the inconvenience cost based discount method in sharing the insured cost per passenger and the number of requests served. And also the ICBD method tends to lead to a more distributed system. And this distributed system like somehow like benefits more from the increase of willingness to pay level and the increase of the number of drivers in the system. And on the right, we have like some future directions that we will attend to. And actually, we are doing now is that, remember what the setting we have here is a static case, meaning that even though the requests are coming in like sequentially, and you are providing the quote immediately when upon the request. However, all of these information are like you end the reception of the request at the start of the operation. And that is called a static case. And we want to develop it for the dynamic case where you are receiving like passengers' requests like during the operation of the ride sharing. And then we want to develop a dynamic ride sharing routing method, because the ones that we use here in the simulation is some simple heuristics to try to test the mechanism, the cost sharing mechanism we design. And we do want to like dig into that aspect to try to see if there is a better like dynamic ride sharing routing method out there. And then we want to do is combine the cost sharing mechanisms and as well as the routing method in dynamic case, and then test their performances, hopefully also in the large data set that we presented. And I guess that will be it for me.
Thank you very much. This was definitely a tour de force in terms of ride sharing, right?
Yeah.
If anybody has any questions, put them in the Q&A box. And while I give you a few minutes to do that, I'm just going to ask a question to both of you. And that is that what would be the steps now that you have this together? What steps would be necessary to actually test it out in the real world?
I think the steps is just basically integrating it to a GIS routing system, and then put it into an app. So this is all right now set up, offline, just using data offline without really integrated into a mapping system. I think the next step would be to take these algorithms and embed them into basically Google's Maps or Waze or any one of those systems.
Do the results fit your intuition?
Definitely. I mean, that from looking at the results that system presented, definitely is it's behaving as you would expect in terms of how the different mechanisms behave in terms of balancing driver recovery versus passenger recovery.
We have a question. Have you considered research from psychology stating that negative experiences or losses, and in this case, it would be the inconvenience of an additional passenger, to be much stronger than a positive experience? This would help better determine the initial price uncertainty with additional passengers and potential discounts.
It's a good question, and that's a really good question. So we don't see additional passengers as a positive at all in terms of the trip length, and unless you include benefits to toll lanes and HOV lanes. I will say basically we view it as a negative, and that's why we have an inconvenience cost. I think the question really is how to model that function. We really don't know that function, right? So we have some. I think that's the key, and that's where the behavioral. I would use the word more. The behavioral aspect is going to be very important. We really don't have any really good idea of what function we should use to model inconvenience.
It's a good point. I'm not seeing any more questions. So I'm going to say thank you very much. I had neglected to mention that this is our National Center for Sustainable Transportation seminar. And I also would like to just take a minute to say that we have one more in our October triple header, which is next week. It's Jeff Boeing, and he's going to talk about street network models. And then we have two of our past seminars that are now available for watching at metrans.org. I want to thank both of our speakers and offer virtual applause.
Thank you.
On the part of everybody here.
Our pleasure.
And thank you very much. And we will see at least some of you next week for the next one.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for giving us a chance to present.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.